Good afternoon, and welcome to this policy debate at the World Bank towards a new social contract. My name is José Manuel Bassat. I'm a communications advisor in the Europe and Central Asia region of the World Bank, and I'll be the moderator for the for the session today. The event is being web streamed, so for those of you who are watching online, feel free to join the conversation by sending questions electronically. Last year, the Europe and Central Asia region of the bank produced this report towards a new social contract that is going to be the basis for the discussion. I mean, the report was presented, but today what we're going to do is something a bit different. We're going to have, we've structured the session today in a way that we hope is going to be interesting. And it's going to be a debate first, almost like two parallel conversations, one on taxation, one on labor markets. Because there is, actually, let me backtrack for a second. There are three types of policy recommendations coming out of the report. One is on, first is on social protection, social insurance, and the delivery of good quality services. Then there's a set of policy recommendations about the flexibility of labor markets. And third, there's some recommendations about options on taxation. On the first issue, on social protection, social insurance, and delivery of good quality services. This we have discussed it in previous events at the bank. So we wanted to focus today's event on basically on the other two, on taxation and on labor markets. So we have structured the first part of the debate as two separate but related conversations. We have asked each of the panelists that I will introduce shortly to provide a short introduction on their position. And the positions that they're going to defend here do not always reflect their own ideas, but will help illustrate the depth of the debate. So, actually, the four panelists that we have are Carolina Sanchez-Paramo, who's Senior Director for the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. And Carolina will be talking about more progressive taxation, including increased taxation on wealth and capital. We have Mary Hallward Dreimeyer, who is Mary, a senior economic advisor in the Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice. And Mary will take the opposing view of Carolina, and thus against taxes that may curb growth and particularly firms' investment. We have Michal Rutkowski, who's a senior director for the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice. And Michal will argue for increased protection of workers in non-standard employment. And more generally, for uniform and universal protection of all workers, no matter the type of employment status. And then we have Hans Timmer, who Hans is the chief economist in the South Asia region, but until last month he was the chief economist in the Europe and Central Asia region, and therefore overseeing the production of this report. And Hans will take the opposing view of Michal, arguing more generally for flexible and loose regulation of labor markets. So this is, we'll start with these two parallel debates, and we'll have some questions for each of the panelists, and then we will bring the two conversations together, and we'll open up to the audience both here and online, and we expect that the session will last about 90 minutes. Then we're gonna actually, before we start, we're gonna ask Cyril Müller, who's the Vice President for Europe and Central Asia, to provide some opening remarks, and finally, what I want to say before we give the floor to Cyril is that when you please, so just when you speak, please use the mic, because again, as we're web streaming the session, we want to make sure that everybody who is watching online can adequately hear. And then also when you speak, introduce yourselves, and if your question is addressing a specific panelist, please mention so. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Cyril to please introduce the session.
Thank you, José Manuel. First of all, Happy New Year to everybody. I think it's probably my last time I'll say it. This week is always my borderline. So we're Thursday midday, we can still go on that. Also starting with that because the topic we've put today for the debate, which is towards a new social contract, was something that was very much in the news and on our minds in 2018. And I expect that to remain very much the case in 2019. I want to thank Hans in his previous role to having really fostered a very open and vibrant debate on this set of issues. I want to thank Mary, Carolina, and Michal for joining us today. You've been part of those debates that we've had in the development, actually, and in the preparation of the report. But it is also today a good opportunity for us to continue a set of discussions, because I think none of those issues are closed issues, and we will have to continue to face them over time. I also believe very firmly and very strongly that this is one of the absolutely key challenges of our time in ECA, and that it is truly a multifaceted issue. It's not a set of issues that you can reduce easily or take just an ideological view. There is a right way and a wrong way. And we will have, I think, I'm actually absolutely certain, we will have a really interesting conversation today. I wanted to make 4 points in my introductory remarks. The first one is that ECA has a long tradition of prioritizing and focusing on equity issues and actually around the concept of what a social contract means. The second point I want to say is that that long tradition has been also based on a very well-developed welfare system, and that welfare system is actually right now, and its effectiveness is actually being questioned. The third point is, like, one of the challenges we are facing is that the nature of inequality may be changing and distributional tensions are rising, yet standard measurements are not showing that much of a difference. So there's a lot of debate around perceptions versus reality into that. And my fourth point I'd like to say, to mention, I'll go a little bit in more details in each of those, is really the looking forward. And I really would like these conversations today to go beyond arguing the various points, to say, okay, what's next and what should we think about? Let me start with the first point I mentioned, which is our long tradition in ECA on equity and prioritizing equity. It is in ECA countries that you will have the more extensive welfare systems with the most extensive redistribution or scale of redistribution. It's also where progressive taxation and more generous social protections have basically been historically taking place. So there is one indicator, one statistic that actually is very interesting for me on that, which is that ECA countries have basically on average that the difference between inequality measured with the Gini index at, in terms of the distribution of market incomes goes from about 50% to about 29% for the distribution of incomes after tax and transfers. So if you think of what this measures is, if you have market outcomes, you would have a Gini of 50 in the European Union. After the distribution of incomes with grants and with transfer, and tax, that is reduced to 29. And that's 21 points, compares very differently from other high-income countries in the world, where that difference, for instance, in my own country, Switzerland, is only 9 points. Australia is 15, Japan is 16, and the US is 11. So there is behind it, and I don't think you would have such redistribution without having truly an underpinning social contract behind it. So societies, I don't think, are naturally bound to distribute by those extents without having, frankly, an underlying social contract. It's also interesting that if you take Eastern European countries that are included in that measurement, such as, let's take Poland or Romania, Croatia, Hungary, and others, how do these, in a way, compare to other emerging economies? And I think, like, that same redistribution in places like Russia, where it's 11 points, Chile, where it is 3.2, Turkey, where it's only 2.5, and Mexico, where it's only 1.9. You can see a very different set of dynamics, right? If you think of emerging economies, upper middle income countries. So that's the first point. So there is something in ECA and in the European Union that is more deeply rooted and has, frankly, a longer experience and was based on a broader, probably, acceptance across society. Now, my second point I wanted to say is having been a child, in a way, of the 1960s in Europe, growing up in Switzerland, and feeling very European, despite Switzerland not being part of the European Union. I think many of certainly my generation feel that there was a triangle or a pyramid, or let's say an anchor, that was really forming a social contract post-World War II on which European prosperity was very much based. And that one was the threefold elements that were linked into that social contract. One was social welfare that I mentioned before. So this ability to use transfer and social protection to equalize and to mitigate gaps. The second was the universal provision of education and health. And I think the health part had a lot to do with improving opportunities, but protecting against downside, and education being considered truly as the big equalizer on the opportunity side. And the third is that Europe was really based, the third part of that social contract really had regulated labor markets as anchors. And I think it was very interesting last year, and I'm mentioning that in my intro remarks, because last year when we had very heated and really lively and vibrant conversations on the report, I always felt into those that we were all in a way being challenged because there was something that was in place that had some, let's say, that felt somewhat in equilibrium, and that when each of those is no longer in place, the whole part, the sum of the parts was really challenged. Now, what I think is also quite important, and it's been quite challenging, is that when you look across society, you not only have issues around inequality, but you also have a sense that issues around social justice, around inclusion, and we take the refugee crisis, for instance, in Europe as one of those examples, is that societies are really struggling with, if you want, sets of events, stress points that challenge, let's say, a perception that of an incrementally positive outlook. And perceptions in Europe around inequality have been sharply growing over the last 10 years. Now, the third point that I wanted to mention, and I think the work that the team did in the report and across a number of other pieces that we've done in ECA and with colleagues in global practices and in research, is that there are, within the issue of inequality or the sets of tensions that are emerging, income may not be the variable. The monetary variables may not be as dominant as they were in those. And I want to emphasize three elements. One, the tensions are very much now intergenerational. So as Europe ages, you can see truly a set of tensions between young people and elder people emerging. And that has a lot of things to do across all three dimensions that were raised in the report. The second is occupation. Let's think jobs. What you are doing, what your skills are around jobs, your occupation has a strong influence on basically your opportunities and the differences that are growing or the gaps that are increasing across groups. And the third, which is something that in Europe I always use a very simple example, the European Union produces every year maps that has each of the European Union on income per capita distribution. So you will have, you know, France, Germany, a certain high income. You will have Romania being on the lower income of the European Union. And when you look at national boundaries, it actually fits a very old picture, a picture that hasn't changed that much, frankly speaking, since World War II, or after World War II. However, when the European Union, which also produces actually maps that look at subnational or the cities level. So you will find that basically income per capita in the capital or the more dynamic cities in the same Romania I was mentioning before is actually quite similar to income per capita in some of the more, let's say, failing regions or cities in high-income Western European countries. And so once you look at that, this issue of spatial gaps, of lagging regions, of distribution of opportunities, both at the levels of jobs, of firms, is a real issue that we in the ECA region are feeling very strongly. And I would argue that certainly that spatial dimension and that set of tensions around it is probably the most acute in ECA compared to any other regions. I would also argue that based on the experience in ECA, that it is likely that other regions, other emerging regions, will see this also as an agenda into the future. Now, let me finally on the point of looking forward. Today, I think, and I would love to, while we will have a debate on two of the three aspects that were put in the report, but I would love at the end of our conversations and through the discussions in the room a little bit, as it says, have a conversation, or let's say seek inputs from colleagues on the following. How, as we are trying to have a conversations on the various three policy areas that we're touching today, I have one question mark is, how do you move forward to find a new equilibrium? Is it an equilibrium with these three elements, or is it something in which we can look more individually, or are we missing parts of the piece? So I would really encourage all colleagues in the room and for people who are online to really put contributions and questions to our panelists and on the debate today that are also, in a way, broader. So don't feel limited by what will be, I'm sure, an excellent debate in the first part, but to really take this discussion forward, and it will be helpful for us also to think through in 2019 on how we want to pursue this work. Thank you, José Manuel.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for the very useful introduction and putting in context both the report itself, but also the conversation that we should have, not just about the report, but in moving forward and how to actually prepare for the role of the World Bank in implementing, in a way, the work with our clients on the new social contract. So I will ask now and Michal, please, we can start with your initial presentation. If we can keep it just a few minutes, then I'll ask Hans to answer you. Thank you.
Good morning and Happy New Year, everybody. We are observing two very important phenomena in the world. The first is the demise of the standard employment contract as we know it. This is linked very directly to the development of gig economy and also to the popularity of more flexible labor market arrangements, working part-time, withdrawing from the labor market in order to come back, doing something as a subcontractor. All those forms of work are in high demand, and we do observe the demise of, very slow one, of the standard employment contract, rapidly growing gig work through platforms, still below 3% of labor force, but with a very, very fast growth. At the very same time, we observe in developing and emerging economies, we observe extreme stubbornness of informality. Countries that were 90% informal 40 years ago, such as India, are 90% informal now. The average level of informality in the world is essentially around 65–70%. So those two phenomena taken together call upon the need to develop mechanisms of social protection for those workers who are not in the formal employment contracts, which has always been a reality for majority in developing and emerging economies, but is increasingly becoming a reality in developed world. Fortunately, at the same time when those two phenomena are happening, there are technological developments, including disruptive technologies, that make it more and more possible to allow those workers who are in non-standard arrangements to be covered by social assistance that is not difficult, but by social insurance. We observe capabilities of systems to observe transactions, tax those transactions, and therefore use those transactions as a basis for contributory social insurance schemes. The examples are in India, direct benefit transfers, pension systems in Ghana or Benin are based on the same principle. I think the way ahead for the developed countries is particularly difficult for those who developed social insurance system based on Bismarckian tradition. Why is that? Because the Bismarckian tradition calls upon linking first social insurance to stable employment contract, second, on financing this social insurance through payroll taxes. And as we know, it doesn't matter whether employee or employer pays payroll taxes. This is overtaxing of labor as one factor of production in order to provide social insurance. It will be easier for those countries that are not based, where systems are not based on Bismarckian tradition, such as Scandinavians, such as Australian or New Zealand, because they are closer to a very important principle which needs to make its way to social protection world, that it is much better to base systems on the broadest available tax base as opposed to focusing on one factor of production such as labor. So in both places, developed countries and developing countries, we really have a big challenge, which is how to ensure workers who are not in standard employment relationship. Interestingly, we observe developments in Europe that very quickly new systems appear to cover those who are self-employed or work as actors, writers. Especially Germany is very active. And I think in the World Bank, we need to be much more in this space because this is the space of the future. Thank you.
Just give the other side of the coin and tell us why you think that these might not be the case, and what are some of the challenges with what Michal was proposing.
Thanks a lot and good afternoon. It seems very simple. You have a new economy, the gig economy, developing, which is hardly regulated, which is informal, alongside a very well regulated and formal old economy. And then the obvious reaction is that you want to create a level playing field, and that's what Michal said also. And you want to come up with social protection systems that cover everybody, irrespective of whether they are in this new economy or in the old economy. And that's actually what is happening in many places, because in Europe we see a deregulation trend already for quite some time in the old formal economy. And you see increasingly that in the new economy there are more regulations coming up. In New York, you have now a minimum hourly wage for the Uber drivers. You have a limitation for the number of licenses for Uber. In Amsterdam, the Uber drivers, they need to go through exactly the same background check as taxi drivers. So you see that convergence, and you see that also for a long time already in developing countries, where there are continuously efforts to bridge the gap between the formal and the informal economy by reducing the power of the insiders in the formal economy and trying to have more formalization of the informal economy. Seems very simple, But I've been asked to be devil's advocate, and it is actually very easy to shoot holes in this kind of reasoning, and with that also to shoot holes in what Michał just presented. And I think the problem is that we don't completely appreciate how the new economy is fundamentally changing our societies. And we often take Uber and Airbnb as examples, but it's already much wider. Exactly at this moment, on the 7th floor, there is another seminar that is about the Alibaba way, how e-commerce is changing the way poverty alleviation in China's rural areas is happening. It completely transforms the villages in China, because now you have all kinds of craftsmen, craftswomen that find new work and are directly connected to global markets and creating a lot more income than they could ever dream of. But Michał said it, you have stock photographers that are selling their work on the web. You have web developers, you have translators, but we are only at the start. With 3D printing, then you can see that people can just individually sell their designs and directly to consumers. We are talking about fragmentation of production, fragmentation of the labor market. There was one recent news article, and that summarized it like that: my parents had only one job for their whole lifetime. I have 6 jobs during a lifetime. My kids will have 6 jobs at the same time. It is fundamentally changing what is happening. And so why do I argue that this is not a case where you should try to create a level playing field and start regulating the new economy? This is not a case where you should try to impose a watered down version of all the protection that in the old economies the unions have fought for and have achieved. You need something really different, and the last thing you need now is regulation of that new economy and coming up with old systems of protection. So I will give 4 arguments for that very quickly. The first argument is don't regulate innovation. When we were doing in the region a study on blockchain and cryptocurrencies, the conclusion was be very careful trying to quickly create a level playing field with the old financial sector, because you have no idea where this is all coming from. There is a lot of creativity at the moment, and don't try to interfere with that. And not only we came to that conclusion, the IMF and many others came exactly to the same conclusion. Be very careful treating this as if it is part of the old financial system. It's the same argument of the infant industry argument, the special economic zones. Be very careful. The second argument is that it might actually be very different markets with very different people with very different skills. The new economy for young people, which have very different skills from the people in the old economy. And we have had many cases of that. That's why the World Bank says actually there might be a big advantage of having informal economies in developing countries, because it employs people that don't have the skills yet to go into the formal economy, and it might be a stepping stone. It might be a way of circumventing all kinds of problems in the market, and you should embrace it and you should keep it apart. That's why the World Bank argued, don't try to come up with labor standards and environmental standards in trade agreements, because we are talking about 2 very different markets, and they shouldn't have the same kind of standards. So that's the second argument. Don't try to unify these 2 very different pieces. The third argument is that if there is a reason to create a level playing field, then it's probably across borders, because that new gig economy is not limited to a nation state. It is directly interacting with all kinds of other people in gig economies who don't even care where they live. And so that is where you should focus on, the cross-border organization of that market, and not so much on the domestic economies and trying to unify that. The fourth and final argument, and then I finish, is that you probably need very, very different protection in that new world. And you shouldn't come up with concept that we all borrow from the old economy. So let's think for a moment about the old economy with the big firms. These firms, they exist because they took advantage of increasing returns to scale. And then you had the situation, you have one owner of a firm, and then you have many employees. That's an unbalanced situation, and so you have unions that are coming up, and they are starting to negotiate, and they will guarantees for a minimum wage. They want to have a mandatory retirement age, and they want to have pension systems. That's how the second pillar developed in Europe. But that's a very special case. If you look at another side of the economy, say farmers, they didn't negotiate with their boss. They were independent. They had another problem, that was the power of the middleman. And they were fighting the middlemen, and they came up with a very different response for their own social safety net. They created cooperatives. They created public goods for themselves. And then they could circumvent that power that they were facing. They were destroying crops after a bumper crop. That was their social protection. Very different system. And I think that in the new economy, the young people, they need very different kind of social protection as what we in the bank are thinking about. Mandatory retirement aid is irrelevant for them when you are working in this way. The unemployment benefits that have been created is not working for the self-employed, because they are not being fired so that they can go to unemployment insurance. They just have a smaller portfolio, and we saw that after the crisis. They absorbed that a lot. So my point is, don't try to unify everything, embrace that new economy. Probably organically, there will be a system being developed for social protection that is suited for that new economy. Don't regulate.
Thank you very much, Hans. And I wanted Michal to ask you. Hans has been trying to poke some holes on the arguments you made, and I think I wanted you to answer him. Especially, I mean, I think there are 2 points that are very salient. Is on the risk of stifling innovation when you do over-regulation, and also on what Hans was describing as that the solution should not be at the nation-state level, but at the kind of transnational level. What do you have to say about these two things?
First, I must say it was a very eloquent elaboration on the merits of segmented labor markets, and I don't believe in segmented labor markets. They are inefficient, and they are particularly inefficient when you expect lots of movements between different parts of the labor market, different status in the labor market. The reason why I argue the case that we need social protection for everybody is so that people do not get stuck in employment in places where they don't want to be, because they do not have there are no means, they are not provided with tools of being protected in transition between jobs, which may require going into self-employment or being contracted out. So I would argue that you would dynamize labor market and would make it more efficient. Second thing I wanted to say is that I would not think that new systems developed for informal sector would mirror the existing systems. I think they should be systems in which the contributions are not felt as a tax. The system should be defined contribution, that should be proportionality between contributions paid and the benefit received, so that they are not felt as taxes and therefore do not discourage employment. I was also talking about using the broadest tax base possible as being an important provider. proviso, which is also, I think, a tool to avoid an employment effect. The biggest problem with employment are payroll taxes, and I would argue, and I think Hans would agree with me, that we need to reduce payroll taxes and move to a broader base. Finally, I agree actually with Hans on the point of international protection. I would love to see one social security system in the world. I think which should be the same for all the countries, which should be which should allow for portability, therefore needs to be defined contributions, and which would respond to growing migration pressures. And migration is good for development. So here on this point of Hans, I am totally with him that it should be sort of done at the supranational level. But my ambitions are just not there because I don't think it's possible. But I think it's the right direction of thinking, and for the World Bank entirely appropriate.
And what about on the issue of stifling innovation?
You know, my sense is that we have now a situation in which the formal sector is over-regulated in developed countries. Therefore, innovation there is stifled. Informal sector has no regulation. The processes Hans described, Uber drivers in Amsterdam, are relatively new. My sense is that if you increase basic regulation in the informal sector and reduce it in the formal sector, you will not have much effect on stifling innovation in the informal sector, but you actually will have positive effect on actually supporting innovation in the formal sector. So on balance, the net effect would be positive.
Hans, any immediate reaction on Micha's rebuttal?
Yeah, Micha said at least on one point, I agree with him. My role is not to agree. So let me point out an inconsistency in the reasoning of Micha. So on the one hand, he says that segmented labor markets, dual labor markets, are very inefficient. On the other hand, he says that I don't want to copy the social protection system of the old economy onto the new economy. So there we have a problem, yeah? Because that old social protection system of the old economy actually suited very well the situation of the old economy. And that means that if you cater to the needs of the people in different parts of the economy, you come up with different systems, which automatically means that there are differences in different parts of the labor market. And I'm not saying that ultimately, at the end, we might evolve into a system where you come up with a unified system, but don't try to do that too quickly and completely take that new development separately. I have also a political economy argument for that, to focus on that instead of focusing on creating a unified labor market.
I just wanted to point out one fact. You said that the old system suited the people in the old economy. They suited those generations at the expense of future generations. The main part of social security systems you are talking about are pension schemes which turned into being Ponzi schemes. And the future generation is going to dearly pay for that. And I don't want that to continue. That's why I want to change those systems, but at the same time to bring to these reformed systems those who are with no protection in the informal sector.
I know that we're in the middle of this debate, but I think we have a second debate that we want to have, and then we're going to bring both of them together. In fact, we started actually mentioning some of the tax issues that I think Carolina and Mary are going to be discussing. But I'm going to ask then Carolina to make your initial presentation, and then we'll actually, after Mary and after some initial conversation between the two of you, we'll open it up to everybody.
Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to what's already a very interesting discussion. Let me start my remarks with just stating a few basic facts so that we can anchor the discussion on, the challenges at hand. We know that inequalities in income, wealth, and opportunities remain high the world over, and Cyril alluded already to some of these. You can pick your statistic. The global Gini coefficient for income is above 50%, and that's the case for many countries in the world. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% in the world bagged about 85% of the world's wealth in 2017. the 8 wealthiest men, and this is truly men, hold as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population. And when you think about intergenerational mobility, we know that in the developing world, if you look at the 1980s generation, so that's really the young adults of today, only 47% of them will have education levels that are higher than their parents. This, to me, is a call for action on all of these different fronts. At the same time, we know that there are many governments around the world, both in the developed countries and the developing countries, that are struggling to meet, to find the resources and to generate the resources that they need to invest on some of the more acute and important needs that they're facing, be it in the infrastructure area or be it in human capital and other needs. So this is sort of the context for this debate. We know that fiscal policy is the main vehicle or one of the main vehicles that governments have to affect the distribution of income, but also to mobilize resources and support policy decisions in the economy. And in fact, when we look at the advanced economies, and Cyril also alluded to this, we know that when you take into account taxation and transfers and you compare incomes before and after those, inequality comes down by about a third. And a third of that third is actually accounted for by taxation, by the role of taxation. The other 2/3 is what transfers are achieving. But interestingly, if you look at what has happened in the world in recent years, despite all those needs and challenges that I actually alluded to at the very beginning, what we've seen is that in the advanced countries, progressivity has actually declined rather than increased in recent years. And this is due to a combination of lowering of marginal tax rates and increase in the thresholds for exemptions. And, think US recent tax cut, if you want an example of that. And of course, we know that in developing countries, progressivity has been low traditionally and remains low as of today. This combines with the fact that, as I said, many countries are struggling to mobilize the resources that they need to finance some of their development needs. So to me, this really paints a picture where we have, on the one hand, urgent needs, and on the other hand, a lot of room for maneuvering, right? I mean, there hasn't been a spike in progressivity in the world in recent years. Developing countries have a lot of space to move in this direction without hitting any kind of extreme issues. And I know that, usually the argument gets made that, when you think about fiscal policy, you should think about transfers as your vehicle for redistribution, and taxation should all be about efficiency. And what I would want to argue is that you should disagree with that. And I have 3 sort of main arguments that I would want to share with you. The first one is that, given financial needs, I don't think developing countries can afford to not fully use the toolkit of different tax that they have at their disposal. And we know that many of these countries at the moment are actually very dependent on indirect taxation, which is not very progressive, but is not giving them sufficient resources. And in fact, a lot of the literature that has looked into what's usually called sort of the optimal level of taxation argues that even when you take into account behavioral responses, so that's individuals and firms, responding to changes in the marginal tax rate, if governments' goals are to maximize revenue, the threshold at which the revenue stops growing and it starts declining, it's 70% for the marginal tax rate. We are very far from that at the moment, okay? So the wolf cries of, oh my God, if you increase progressivity, your revenue would collapse and growth could stop. This is just not supported by the evidence. The second argument that I want to make is, you've very frequently, I'm sure as I have heard that, progressivity creates disincentives, people will work less, they will save less, they will invest less. Luckily for me, and unfortunately unluckily for Mary, the evidence, again, does not support that. And reality doesn't either. But let's first talk about the evidence, and then let's have the eyeball test of whether this is supported in reality. Research by, well-known academics such as Piketty, such as Emmanuel Saez, such as Diamond, so we are talking people who are considered leaders in their fields, tell us that first, labor supply effects and saving effects of increases in marginal tax rates are non-existent in the aggregate. But more interestingly, they are actually very strong at the bottom of the distribution and non-existent at the top. And this is actually not an argument against progressivity, but in fact an argument for progressivity. When you look at when behaviors start to really change in negative ways, meaning people responding to increases in the marginal tax rate start to evade, or they start to try to take advantage of the tax code to find loopholes or to change income across income sources, we are again talking about rates that are in the order of 70 to 75%. Again, we are not in that world. We are far from that world. And more generally, people like Piketty, people like the IMF, these are not your sort of radical left-wing outlet. This is the IMF. Recently published work saying that there is no clear evidence that progressivity, at least at the levels that we have observed since the 1980s, okay, so over the last 3 decades, has had any harmful effect on economic growth. So hopefully, that lays out for you, where we are and what we know about the effects of progressivity on growth. But if that doesn't satisfy you, just look around. I mean, look at this economy over the last 40 years. Clinton years, tax increases, strong growth. Trump years, tax declines, strong growth, but driven by consumption. It's not driven by investment. We don't see capitalists sort of flocking, to grow their businesses, etc. So it just doesn't add up. The evidence is not there. And we know that there are a few examples around the world of countries that have experimented with flat personal tax systems. Those experiments have not paid off, neither in terms of revenue nor in terms of investment rates. And finally, my third argument, and I do obviously have to make that argument, is an argument of fairness, okay? I told you before that a large share of the capital and the wealth in the world basically is in very few hands. I also told you that because progressivity has been declining rather than increasing over the last few years, what this has translated to is that more and more we are moving to a world where the middle class supports the poor, or rather, salaried and wage workers are supporting informal workers or those that don't have work at all, while the rich are basically left to enjoy the riches. I don't know about you, this is not the world where I want to live in. I hope it's not the world where you want to live in either. And I think if we are all concerned about inequality of opportunity, which I think we are, we need to be concerned about inequality of outcomes. It's not just enough to level the playing field. I think sometimes the inequalities are so large that you actually have to equalize endowments. So just to end, I want to put in the spirit of, taking radical positions, I want to put a radical proposal on the table, which is actually not my proposal. This is a proposal by the late Tony Atkinson, and it's a proposal that he made to the UK government in 2015 before he unfortunately passed away a bit over 2 years ago. And what he argued was that on the basis of everything that I share with you, what the government should do is tax capital, of course, excluding, with certain thresholds, but, tax capital progressively, and use the revenue of that capital to grant a one-time endowment to every adult at the age of 18. So this is an endowment, it's not a transfer. What this means is you use the revenues of the tax to basically give every 18-year-old a grant that they can use for whatever they want. And his argument was that this would level the playing field, level it in a way that reduced inequalities in capital endowments generated by families' background and wealth, etc. It would also ease credit constraints for youth and give them, in a way, the opportunity to then, decide what to do with their money. And that because it was an endowment rather than a transfer, it has full agency. You are basically empowering potential investors to use this money to invest in themselves. So I'll just put it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. A very passionate initial statement, Mary, that I think I would like you to first make your own statement, but also at one point I also want to respond to some of the things that Carolina has put on the table.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Very much appreciate being here. Again, Happy New Year to everybody. All right. So first of all, major basic umbrella issue at stake is trying to understand and balance what is desirable and what is feasible. And then I thought that was actually going to be very straightforward. But in fact, even if you just start with the first piece of desirability, which is what most of this has been around, we have 3 different kinds of things and potentially a 4th. So the first basic point, unless we really understand what it is we're trying to do, we're not going to come up with a solution that's going to meet it. And nor is it particularly clear that a single solution is going to meet our 3 different visions of what potentially is desirable. And then I think we really do need to come back to what is feasible. And the fact in some sense, the big message there is that's what's come up last. And that, I think, is extremely telling and gives, again, some sense of a lack of internalization of what some of the trade-offs are and a little reality check on what some of that notions of desirability might be. So 3 different kinds of arguments and motivations that have been put up there. So one is around inequality. And so do you want to tax things directly just to deal with inequality? Do you want to tax those at the top to get rid of the top, bring down the top, inequality comes down, and that is what's desirable? So that's one question. Second is, no, we have this whole new social contract, and what we're trying to do is come up with a whole new set of benefits, and our concern is a more humanitarian, human right, all these different people that don't have access to different kinds of things that they need, they deserve them. And this may be something for which there may, very big question mark, be some social consensus, and how do we pay for them? In which case that level of what kind of benefits and what package you're going to offer needs to be looked at in terms of what on earth is that going to cost, not just in a static but in a dynamic way. A third one, which was sort of a little bit how Michael started, was that technology, and Hans picking this up, has changed everything, and its demise and rapid growth, etc. And how much has technology really changed, and is that what is really driving this? And there, I think there's sort of 2 different parts. I mean, as Michael then sort of went on to say, well, yeah, okay, it's at a small level, it's 3%, but growth is really big. In fact, the growth has been down put too. So take the top 2 labor economists. So this is Kruger and Katz, have just come out saying, our seminal work saying that this gig economy is really growing. Well, actually, it's less than half of what we thought it was. And it was a data issue. And so while it is very popular and you see it in certain high-profile areas, the idea that this is a demise of everything is a vast exaggeration. On the other hand, there are some issues around technology that offer some other kinds of solutions, as well as some other very practical challenges. So to me, when I sort of look at what is desirable, rather than just sort of saying, here's a big bill, now how are you going to pay for it, is really sort of thinking, okay, look, let's look at this sort of idea of growth and distribution and how they may be interconnected. And this sort of question of, what share of the pie do you care about versus how big is that piece of the pie? So you may be able to get a bigger share of the pie, but if in the doing of that, the pie is overall smaller, you may actually have less, in that sense that you're eating. And ideally what you want to do, and I know mixed metaphors is, quote, grow the pie. And if you can, in the best of all possible worlds, have a bigger slice of a bigger pie, excellent. But I bet a lot of people would take a smaller share of a pie if, in fact, it was more pie. Right? So this is sort of a big question. And I think what we want to do is not just sort of look at this sort of redistribution on its own, but look at the incentives of what is it going to mean in terms of growth. Because the biggest determinant, in fact, of how sustainable and how big that piece of pie is that people are going to get is determined by growth. And so looking at the disincentives, looking at what different kinds of taxation, what the dynamic and not just static implications are going to be is what's going to matter. So I want to look at this from just sort of a couple of different perspectives. So one of them is around this idea that it would be fine to have a marginal tax rate of 70%. And in fact, the world did have that for a certain amount of time. It has been taken away. And this is, again, a difference between a static sense of what the cost might be and what some of these dynamic ones would be. And countries around the world have voted on this in practice from all different kinds of governments with all kinds of different political leanings and reduced those tax rates. That there is efficiency costs to those kinds of enormous tax rates. So in fact, that in practice, what you've seen is dramatic decline. And even in this sort of most recent, quote, populist era, you continue to see what is the package that has been accepted, including by democratically elected countries, is very different from some of the kinds of concerns of what has been raised here. So a lot of what the issue has been is really wanting a regime that is going to give the growth, the productivity gains, more resources to be therefore available and opportunities for people to be able to pursue them. So I think what we want is a system that's really going to be looking at that. One thing that I do think, however, that also needs to be brought into this, and why these marginal rates also matter, comes back a little bit to this: is this a domestic or an international phenomenon? And certainly if you're going to start looking at taxation, particularly on the capital side, capital is very mobile. And increasingly mobile. And that is actually, to me, one of the big things that technology is changing, is actually vastly increasing the mobility of taxation. So this comes back to this feasibility question. And to some extent, this actually really is a challenge. And it's a challenge on multiple dimensions, but it is a reality that we need to take into account when we're trying to look at what actual choices are being put in front of us. So on the one hand, so the nature of technology and the kinds of capital that are being created, a lot of the new creation is coming in forms of, quote, intangible capital. So this is not just sort of the brands, it's the algorithm, it's the data. And what studies are finding is that this very much is being sort of manipulated as, and it can be because it's data, it doesn't have the same sort of physical presence, it's extremely mobile as to where that gets put and claimed for different kinds of tax purposes. And so statistics from the OECD, backed by the IMF, backed in fact by top publications in this institution, give very sobering numbers. Right? So if you look at the top Fortune 100 companies, 60 of them have offices in two places, Cayman Islands and Bermuda. Why? Corporate tax rate is 0, right? And they can do that, and it is legal. And there's other cases where it's not quite as extreme as that. But the OECD's estimates is that between 120 and 240 billion dollars a year are being, moved around precisely to avoid different kinds of taxes. So is this a problem? Yes, but just sort of saying, but we're going to tax it isn't going to be an answer. So we need to have, again, look at what is feasible. And there's been this huge set of efforts done internationally. The OECD so far has really taken the lead on it, looking at this base erosion and profit shifting, right, that came up with those kinds of numbers. And the kinds of recommendations that they're coming up with at the moment of how do you try and tax this tangible, movable assets have come up with schemes that so far have generated $3 billion over 3 years in tax revenue, compared to more than 100, potentially more than 200 annually that is lost. So yes, there's interest, there's an understanding this is an issue, but the practical how do you actually do this is in fact something that very much needs to be put on the table. And I will say, one of the things that I've done is attending some of these G20 meetings and the framing working group, which has the finance ministers and central bankers around the table. And one of the things that the OECD's report makes very, very clear, there is no international consensus on how to do this. And having sat through multiple of these meetings, and Vilo unfortunately just left because he sits there with me, people put it on the table, yep, really important, absolutely no consensus, and therefore it really even doesn't get discussed, which gives an indication of how far away we are on some of those. So I think in that sense, it is something that needs to be looked at. It's incredibly contentious. So when we're going and sort of saying to our clients, what is this social contract? We need to look at what kind of revenue in fact can be mobilized. What is the trade-off in terms of growth? What are the dynamic potential trade-offs there? So it's not that we shouldn't look at taxation, but you need to not have the rose-colored glasses on and use that to come back and feed into, okay, so how does that change what you think is desirable? So I'm just going to end with my last point, which I think is, again, kind of telling. This report is great. It's 224 pages. The number of pages dedicated to how do you actually pay for this? Less than 2.5. 1% of real estate was spent on that. If you look at the WDR, same thing, right? It's the very last subsection is on cost. And do you know how much space is actually looked at progressive taxation? Half of one paragraph. All right? So it's a recognition that we need to pay for these things. There's far more space dedicated to excise taxes, to ways of improving VAT, things on carbon taxes. So it's not that revenue doesn't need to be generated, but I think that reflects a reality of what we need to do in terms of moderating the kinds of things we can realistically deliver and how we need to pay for them. Thanks.
Thank you, Marion. You were talking about reality check, and the last point was an interesting one on that, but I think it's worth discussing further. But I wanted to ask you, Carolina, Mary mentions that a smaller share of a bigger pie, if it's more pie, is going to be a good outcome. Is that the case? And actually, how do you convinced that more progressive taxation is actually not detrimental to economic growth?
So let me start, because Mary asked, first she asked, well, what's the goal? And then, she got to that, right? So I think to me the goal is very clear. And I don't think at any point I said, well, it's inequality for the sake of reducing inequality. But I think, at least from my perspective, individuals and I think governments have aspirations about, guaranteeing a minimum living standard, to the people that live in those countries, building middle-class societies, and ensuring that you have intergenerational progress. So that is the goal, right? Again. So on this story of grow the pie versus the share, I frankly think that we need to move away from this, I think, false dichotomy between you either grow or you redistribute, okay? You can grow and redistribute. That's the point that I try to make. And in fact, the evidence tells you that you can grow and redistribute. So it's a false dichotomy. So I argued earlier that, there is no evidence that higher progressivity, and I'm not arguing for 70% tax rates. I'm just arguing for more progressivity. And as I said, there's a lot of margin to go from where we are, before we get to the 70%. There's no evidence that that has a negative impact in growth. However, there is lots of evidence that high inequality leads to lower and more volatile growth. So even if we care about growth, it actually turns out that inequality damages growth in the long term. And if you look at the record of countries over time, there has not been a single country that has reached high-level income status with high inequality levels. So even if you want to make it about growth, the reality is the evidence on progressivity is not there, whereas the evidence on high inequality is there. So I just don't buy the grow versus, you can do both. You can grow and you can redistribute. And I am not arguing for extremes. I'm just arguing for something that corrects some of what I think are the extreme imbalances of the current moment. I completely agree with Mary that the challenge of taxing financial capital, which is extremely mobile in the current context, is enormous. But I think there are other things that can, while we work on that, so on that I'm in full agreement with you. I don't have the answer, you don't have the answer, nobody seems to have the answer. But that's not the only thing that can be done. So for example, we didn't talk about things like taxing other forms of wealth, immobile assets, land and property. That's a lot more doable. People cannot put that in their bag and walk away. Okay, so maybe that's something that we need to talk about. Our colleagues across the street are talking about it. And this was something hard to do many years ago, but and now here technology helps us. Things like having a cadastre, et cetera, that were very hard to do in the past are no longer so hard to do. So why aren't we exploring those possibilities? Something like inheritance tax. Rates are extremely low in the advanced countries. These things don't even exist in the developing countries. Why aren't we looking more into that? The evidence again tells us that more progressivity on inheritance taxation has absolutely no impact other than, parents leave a little bit less to their children. And interestingly, kids that receive a lot of money from their parents actually tend to work less. So if this is all about growing and working, maybe we should cut down on those inheritances and create incentives for people to work. So that's what I would want to say about that.
Mary, any last intervention before we open it to the group?
So I have to say there is, again, this inconsistency a little bit of trying to say it's not just about reducing inequality and then all your concerns are the evidence of high inequality has problems and that you are wanting, in part, to reduce inequality for its own sake. So I think for me, the emphasis, so I agree we don't want to have an over, and can you have some of both? Yes, I think you can get some of both. Are there trade-offs? Absolutely, there can be trade-offs. So if you're going to do a lot on redistribution, you will end up growing at often a lower rate. Are there examples? So I think does it need to be an extreme if it's all of one or the other? No. But are there a lot of cases where in emphasizing a chunk of the distribution, you're going to do it at the expense of the best allocation of resources? So I'm going to come back sort of 2 points. One, the Atkinson example in the UK. So there were a couple of different things that sort of came out of that different idea. So on the one hand, this sort of, it sounds really nice, and here's an endowment, and it deals with some of this intergenerational, so now 18-year-olds can get a chunk of money at a time in their life when they really might be able to do something with it. And the very next argument came in, extremely sort of paternalistic. Yeah, but they might do that. They may consume it. They may buy cars. They may go on expensive vacations. You know, they're going to buy all these clothes. They're going to go clubbing, and they're not going to use that money well, right? So then there was going to be all these regulations about what you could and couldn't do. So it was this sort of nanny state of we'll give you money and tell you exactly what you can and can't do with it, which is sort of counter to a chunk of what they want to do. And then the other question, not necessarily so much from a nanny state perspective, is the use of those assets, right? Because it's not being allocated in the sense of who can really use them to the best uses. It's being done, you know, each person gets the same amount. And so if what you want is growth, that's not the allocation rule, right? Some people are going to be able to use them in ways that can be more creative, more innovative, and be able to turn them into growth opportunities more than other people will. So this idea that, oh, if you give everybody the same sort of thing, particularly early on in life, they're all going to have the same opportunities, that just isn't true. There's other complementary inputs, there's differences in human capital, broadly understood, different kinds of behavioral interests. You're going to get unequal outcomes, and you may well be using an awful lot of resources in not very efficient ways. So while it, again, can sound nice and desirable, the outcomes that actually come from it may not meet anywhere near what you want. On the other hand, at the risk of not being provocative, so the issue, I think, in terms of, so I'm not going to argue you should never, you know, tax capital. I think that I'm sort of more just saying we need to think hard about how much we are and really differentiate different kinds of, quote, capital. And I would say your distinction there at the end is actually a really important one. So on two dimensions. So one, things like property is not movable, right? So it you know, land is where it is, and that has that has some real advantages. Both because you can find it, you can value it, and you can tax it. The other is that, with some obvious exception, it's not the sort of productive asset. So yes, agriculture, land matters enormously, and it matters if you're talking urban and rural and et cetera. But a lot of the sort of real sort of productive, innovative capital is not property. And a lot of the property at this point isn't actually the physical land, it's real estate on top of it, which again is not the same sort of productive asset. We care socially, access to housing, and in some sense, if taxing this and changing some of the unbelievably advantageous tax rules that real estate has had may in fact be a way of taxing a subset of capital that would free up more resources for more productive uses. So for me, the aim is how do we increase productivity? And so if the tax comes on some of that less mobile, less productive, I think that is at least a partial. And then the other is this inheritance, which again, the equity arguments I think are strongest there. And then the other, I think frankly, is back on this behavioral, and that those are ones, the behavior that gets changed is the tax dodges. And again, that's not necessarily a productive thing. So being able sort of to really try and do something in that sort of very subset, I think is great. It is a small amount of overall wealth and taxation that are going to meet the kinds of estate taxes in most countries. So do I think it's one partial? Yes. So I think property and some of those inheritance are sub-bits of quote, more progressive capital taxation. But it unfortunately is not going to generate all of what the rosiest glass versions of the desirability are wanting to get.
Thank you very much, Mary. And now I want to bring those two conversations together. Actually, even more than that, I think I want to move towards a more general conversation about the new social contract. And I want to start with a question myself, first to the four of you. And I think the conversation we had and the positions you've expressed, all of you, are very technical in nature. And if we look at in a way, what has been moving the debate in Europe, in this country, in the United States, and around the world, has been very often conversations that are not technical in nature, that kind of the populism behind some of the radicalization that we're now witnessing shows that very often we're trying to address a problem only with technical solutions and not going beyond that and building consensus for something that is broader. So the question is, what should be the role of the World Bank in helping our clients, our partners, are typically executive branches of government? How can we help them have a kind of a dialogue about the new social contract that goes beyond the technical and helps them build consensus for something that it's much wider than a reform or a set of reforms. It's how society is organized. So So it's actually two questions almost, but how does that dialogue happen, and what is the role in the World Bank with our technical expertise, but moving beyond the technical?
Oh, okay, so I'll be provocative again here on this one. I mean, to me, this is actually another slightly different and unfortunately sad reality check, is if you look at the nature of some of this populism, the part of the income distribution that gets a lot of response is not actually worries of inequality at the top end, which is a little bit implicit in some of this debate. And it's not so much, oh my goodness, the rich are so rich, we need to take taxes away from them. It's really distribution at the bottom end and anxiety about people just below you getting more than you do for less work than or effort than you do. And that's really sort of a discouraging, and in some sense it's sort of the opposite of what you're presuming is the concerns about inequality. And this may be a little bit more true in the United States, but a lot of the anti-immigrant is people coming in with a little bit less education, a little bit less income, and they're going to get these benefits they haven't worked for and I have, and they're going to reduce my wage, and an incredible anger about people, quote, just below you, and you're sort of feeling insecure about whether you're going to maintain your position, quote, just above them, which isn't a very pretty picture. But it is a very different understanding of what kinds of, quote, inequality and insecurity are at risk. But I think some of this populism is a quite different understanding of the inequality debates as how we necessarily have looked at it. And so it's actually calling for a public discussion, much more along what some of this has been implicit of actually having a social contract that is inclusive at the bottom end.
I would like to address your question, José Manuel, which is a very good one. Both questions. The first is, I think you are absolutely correct that we need to go beyond working with governments. In fact, in pension reform projects, including in early projects in ECA, we were always talking to trade unions and employers associations as well, which is a part of civil society. And at some point, we made a commitment that every pension reform project should have a communications component, so that we actually deliberately continue communicating as the reform moves along. And I think this is exactly the right direction. The problem is in those countries in which governments don't want us to talk to unions or civil society, and obviously they are there. On your cross-border issue, I am of a view that we should be much more active in talking about migration, and talking especially about how migration is indispensable for development. It's a good thing for development. The problem we are having now is that because of the tragic forced displacement crisis, there is a confusion between who is a migrant, who is a forcefully displaced person, which adversely affect a narrative. Migration is good for development. There is a lot of migration. In fact, the number of migrants worldwide is more than 10 times bigger than refugees. It's good for development. We need more of that, and we need to work with governments and beyond on frameworks for migration, because migration needs to be managed, needs to be organized, and if not us, then who? I would say takes an initiative on that. So we should be far more active, and that probably applies to other cross-border issues, but certainly it does apply to migration.
So just a couple of reactions on my end. And, you know, I agree with Mary that I think in the US and in Europe, there is a little bit of a fear that, you know, other people are coming and taking things away from us. But actually, when I look more broadly across the world, I don't really think that's what's at the root of, for example, what we saw during the Arab Spring, right? And what we are seeing in other places. And in fact, I think what I see in the developing world is a concern about what's happening with the top of the distribution and the fact that things are becoming more unequal rather than equal. And, you know, three pieces there, right? Work that Bill and others in EFI have done recently shows clearly that as people form aspirations now in a more global way, right? Because they have information about how people live in other countries and in other places, they realize that, you know, the sky is the limit, right? I mean, it's not just about how your neighbor lives, but there are people around the world that actually live much better than you do. And that matters for how frustrated they are or not with their lives and their reality and their opportunities. We know that particularly for youth, there is a frustration about the disconnect between what they feel was the promise, particularly in the form of education, and the reality in the form of jobs. And, you know, Cyril alluded a little bit to this. And you know, recent work that we've done on intergenerational economic mobility showing that it is actually very low is also a source of frustration, because I think all of you who are parents would identify with me in saying that, you know, we all want our kids to do better than with it, right? Or at least as well. And when you are told or you perceive that that won't be the case, that is a source of frustration in themselves. So, and again, this is not frustration about, the bottom. Of course, everybody has a fear that, something could happen and they could lose, their financial standing. But a lot of this is about your prospects for growth and for doing better and seeing that other people are doing a lot better and maybe not due to their merit. So I think there's a little bit of both depending on where you're looking. I fully agree with what Michal said in terms of what we can do. The only thing that I would add there is that I think there's still a lot of sort of myths to be dispelled there in terms of what informs people's perspective, and I don't mean just sort of virtual facts or alternative facts in the US. I think this is true sort of more broadly. So I think part of the role that we continue to play is, shedding some light and sort of debunking some of those myths and trying to ground the discussion with a variety of partners on actual data and evidence. And I think that's a role that we should continue to play no matter what.
Thank you.
In this discussion, I think we should take populism very seriously, and we should always consider the political economy of our proposals and discussions, and we are failing in doing that. So linking it back to the earlier discussion, many of our proposals, they imply a deterioration of benefits for people in the old economy, and some kind of organization, regulations in the new economy where the young people don't recognize themselves and they said this system is not working for us. And we are not considering these consequences. And when we are talking about feasibility, what we're thinking about is capital that goes across borders, and so we can't touch that. We are not thinking about labor and how they are reacting. And Cyril in ECA introduced a very interesting concept. He called it the zoo model. And that was about how to deal with state-owned enterprises. And his point was, don't focus completely and give prominence to reforming state-owned enterprises in countries, because it creates a lot of problems, potentially unemployment, a lot of resentment, and you have to deal with that. Instead, try to ring-fence those state-owned enterprises and focus completely on the new private sector that is developing, and once you are successful there, you make the state-owned enterprises less relevant. And that is an approach that is driven by that idea. What is the consequence for sentiment, and that leads to a much more positive agenda. And then finally, I don't think it matters that much with whom we communicate, but in general how we communicate. And that means that we have to frame much more the debate, show different sides, as we are doing now, of the debate, instead of focusing completely on prior actions as if we know what the solution is. We should focus a lot more on experiments and trying to learn, and help organize the debate also with the government.
So, I think your sort of question of who we should be engaging with, and so the communication out is certainly one piece of it. The other is listening and who we listen to. And I have to say, one of the key underrepresented group would be the private sector. And really engaging and listening and understanding what the private sector sees as constraints and opportunities and how they are likely to respond. There can be unintended consequences. There can be things we haven't, or our counterparts on the government side may not have thought about. But in terms of, where are we going to get some of the kinds of capital? So you can get resources from taxation, but the bank with this whole MFD and the IFC 3.0, et cetera, is how do we leverage the physical capital, the human capital, the managerial capital in the private sector to help solve a lot of the development problems that we're trying to engage in. And different parts of this institution engage with the private sector more than others. But I do think that's something that's really important in hearing and listening. I like the experimenting. And we have to be savvy about what we hear and filter, right? So there will be self-interest in what we hear for whoever that would be. And that certainly matters for the private sector as well. We don't want to be naive. But I think that if we aren't listening to sort of the full range of voices, we're unlikely to be offering the best solution.
Thank you, Mary. I would want to spend now the last part of this session with opening up to all of you. And also, if there are any questions online, we'd also want to answer them. We'll take, I think, 3 questions at a time. If you can just please raise your hand and then introduce yourself. We have one here, Robbie, and someone there as well. Introduce yourself, and if you're addressing it to someone specifically, please say so. Thank you.
I think.
Hi. Oh. Where did you point?
Sorry.
Okay. All right. I'm Hannah Brixio, practice manager for social protection jobs, covering MENA with some prior experience and life in ECA. I feel that the answer on what is desirable and feasible and how to get to the new equilibrium perhaps depends more on the context that came up in the debate. And in particular, I would emphasize history and for the future migration more fully. Now, in terms of history, and Cyril alluded to it, the history of social democracy and nation state and so on plays obviously a strong role. And for example, in MENA, when we did a recent flagship on social contract, trust, voice, and incentives, we looked back to the 7th century and analyzed what were the key elements that have influenced the expectations of the population today, and what are the inertia that must be overcome in shaping or in renewing the social contract for the future. And this comes, it goes back to political institutions, political promises, obviously social institutions, culture, as well as administrative institutions. And Michal alluded to the difficulty of overcoming, for example, the Bismarckian tradition. So I think if we could, for the way forward, also kind of anchor the debates in the region with our counterparts more in history, I think it would perhaps also resonate better. Now, for the future, what I see, and my question would be to the discussants, is how to consider the way forward in the context of the possibly migration at scale. Considering for the future the demographic transitions, growing population in Africa, the challenges on population in ECA, and the clear development benefits that are brought with migration, as Michal mentioned, but also the perceptions of considering social norms and the cultural impediments to the perceptions on migration. So how to reconcile this with the thinking about the new social contract and the way forward to the new equilibrium? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose Manuel. Thank you, everyone. My name is Robbie Senderovich. I'm a practice manager for governance in ECA West. I have a question for Cyril. So basically, listening to all the panelists, Cyril, what I get out of the discussion is that there seems not to be one monolithic social contract, right? So you may have a number of social contracts among a variety of social actors at the same time. So you may have people who pay taxes because they expect better services, people who vote because they expect accountability, countries who are opening their borders because they believe that is going to bring integration, and with that, peace in the region, people who were able to get higher salaries in exchange for more productivity, people who were able to get lower salaries in exchange for job stability, people who behave well because they're gonna get access to heaven. So, social contract is open. So this also gives us new chances for collective action in the region, and maybe a new constellation of possibilities for collective action. So my question to you is, how do you see these chances for collective action behind the pro-poor agenda and the pro-shared prosperity agenda in the region?
Asta Žvinienė, I work on pensions and LAC. The issue I would like to raise is that social contract is not really very social, the way it works. It's mostly people interacting with the state on a very individualistic level. There is a lot of paperwork to fill, and then some cash may be coming your way, but that often kills agency, and weakens social ties with family, with community, which potentially could be another network that could help in the time of need. And partially why the social contract is so expensive, especially in ECA, is because there is this implicit assumption that this other network, the really social one with family and with community, does not exist. So everybody needs this interaction with the state, and that's why it becomes so expensive. My question is whether the new developments actually offer an opportunity to go back, because as labor markets become more flexible, our time management is easier. We could probably, within our community and within our families, we could offer more social services and more help to the people who are around us. On the other hand, the state also, it seems to me, now has tools to better evaluate who has the social network and who doesn't. And potentially, if we could differentiate between people who need the access to the social contract with the state versus the social contract with your immediate community, then the social contract maybe can be made a bit less expensive. And I think that applies both on the benefit-paying side, but also on the contribution-paying side. So I was just wondering what the panel thinks of that.
Who wants to go first? Michal?
Two things which came to my mind listening to the questions. One is, Robbie, your list of trade-offs. I fully agree with that. So the way I would think about it is you have different, indeed, outcomes, different social contracts. What is, however, key is the credibility of the contract. And this credibility, in my view, depends, this is Acemoglu's writing, but these are inclusive institutions. If you have this social contract negotiated in the context of inclusive institutions, it's likely to be more credible. On Hannah's history point, that reminded me of a paradox. This time it's not Acemoglu, it's Mansour Olson, the logic of collective action. I think the problem here is that, with history, the problem is that in order for society to progress, then some events that undermine old elites are good for this nation. That's why we have this paradox that the book Great Levelers, which is that only plagues and wars meaningfully changed the distribution of income, right? Olson had the same in mind a bit, that you need to actually destroy the old order because new order will be more inclusive and new people will come. So what the debate here was today is interesting because I think you are absolutely both right getting at inequality of assets. Because you didn't say that, but the reason you want to tax inheritance is because inequality of assets is far bigger than inequality of incomes. So getting on assets, it's good, except that there is no credible case in the history of doing it meaningfully without a war or a plague. That's the problem.
Yes. Anyone else want to answer any of the questions that Hans, maybe, yeah, please.
Yeah, the issue of migration was raised now a couple of times, and in general, the problems of the cross-border coordination and what can the World Bank do. And I think we are failing there. We are too often presenting it as a kind of an abstract international issue that somehow miraculously has to be solved by international institutions. And I think what we should put a lot more effort in is helping developing countries develop their voice on those kind of issues. And it's true for climate change. I've argued that for a long time. If you look at the whole international debate the last couple of decades on climate change, it was always proposals developed in the West which show the vested interest of the rich countries, and then developing countries are looking at it and they say, what is in it for me? No, thank you, and by the way, it's your problem. And what the bank has not done is talk to developing countries and ask them, how would you solve the global problem? And then you get very different answer. And then almost immediately you link climate change policy to energy security, because that is what they are struggling with at the same time, and they reinforce each other. And then to push that, together with these developing countries in an international debate. The same is true for migration. The view on migration in the developing world is so much different from the discussion that we are focusing on. The size of the problem is so much different in developing countries from what we are talking about all the time in ECA. We are talking about the problem in Poland that is about absorbing 1,600 people, while at the same time, since they joined the EU, 2.5 million Poles moved to other countries and 1.5 million Ukrainians came into Poland, and our discussion is about these 1,600 people. If we much more would link up with developing countries and ask them what is your view and how can we help, and then start pushing that in the international debate, we would be a lot more effective, I think.
Robbie, Cyril will answer the question after the next round of questions. So you had a lady here in the middle of the table that wanted to ask a question, then Pablo, you wanted to ask a question. Let me also, okay, the third question there. So let me actually, but also there is one question online that I will read from someone by the name of Zahid Mahmoud. Said, how will globalization affect tax policies for entrepreneurship in Europe and Central Asia in the next decade? So then we go, please,
So thank you, everyone. This has been extremely interesting debate. So thank you to all the panelists. My name is Eva Clover, and I work in the governance global practice. I happen to be part of a research center that worked on understanding the Nordic welfare state. It's part of the Department of Economics at University of Oslo. And it was basically coming from the assumption that, or looking at the assumptions like, why is it that everything the Nordic countries have done have gone against what neoclassical economics prescribes? Is it something wrong with economics, or are there other factors involved? And one of the conclusions that they came to the extent that you can come to conclusions on such a broad topic, was that indeed it has to do with the institutions. Nordic institutions are very different from American institutions whom the neoclassical economics were tested on. So one of the things that I thought was interesting for this discussion, you asked about the way forward. And I think it's absolutely important to look at those three pillars together. The taxation, the social protection, and what's the third one? Labor. To give a very brief example from the Nordic countries, in the 60s, women wanted to start joining the labor market. And then they started demanding childcare. So the government started rolling out childcare, which enabled more women to work. That again expanded the childcare system even more. And then what happened was that, and this has now been recently documented by the OECD, this has led to something between 10 and 20% of increase in annual growth in GDP over the years in the Nordic countries, and it's very high in Norway as well. And not only that, the kids who were able to go to public childcare, they also increased their productivity and contributed through this tax system to a higher GDP per capita. So when you talk about trade-off between equity and growth, I think it depends a lot on the institutions. So, and I totally agree that you don't have to have a trade-off, but you have to see these things, jointly, because they are related, and there are social and economic spillovers between them that are important. A last point on innovation. Norway actually have a higher rate of innovation than the US, and that is probably surprising to many. We have a massive sovereign wealth fund. So we have oil. You could think that would stifle innovation. We have high taxes, huge welfare spendings, etc., etc., etc. But we have a higher rate of innovation. Why? Because when employers want to expand and see that they have to make changes, it doesn't matter that much, because you have a social security net that makes it more easy to transition into a different state. So we have very productive companies for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Pablo Moreno from the IMF Executive Board. I apologize for that. No, very, very quickly, a question to Carolina. I mean, I agree with a lot of things that you've said, and particularly your quote of Atkinson. I will subscribe all his 15 proposals. But you were saying the issue of indirect taxation is taxation is about efficiency, expenditure is about redistribution. But the question, my question is, I think that taxation is more now a question of efficacy, and I think was or where do I find the money? You know? And you've mentioned wealth, but you're here in a context where you have a globalized economy, you have a race to the bottom in income taxation, corporate, personal income, you have to deal with the problem of competition and the tax wedge. So in that context, moving from direct taxation to indirect taxation is not, it probably could be more effective in terms of increasing revenue, and that this is what some Scandinavian countries are doing. And even more so, you can make indirect taxation progressive because you have the technology can help you make it progressive. You can have exemptions and subsidies to low income people. So how do you deal with that? Because I'm not sure. You only talked about wealth. And then I have also a small nuance for Mary. You were saying that the issue is about relative income. I think there is also a strong issue of instability and insecurity. I mean, I don't have enough money to make my lifetime decisions, and I can fall off the cliff very quickly into poverty. So I'm insecure about my life. So thank you. There.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Arthur Sot from the French ED office. So first of all, thank you very much for this report, which was really interesting. As a French citizen, I must say that our social contract is currently under very high pressure, and this report has been an excellent companion lecture to think about the crisis we are experiencing. One particular aspect I wanted to highlight, and on which I have a question, is a point raised by Cyril that is also well identified in the report, is increased inequality due to to rising geographical disparities. So I think it's really something that we are experiencing in most advanced economies. Agglomeration forces that favors urban centers to the detriment of peri-urban and rural areas, and these rising economic inequalities give birth to rising economic polarization. So it's very clear when you see polling maps of vote in the US, in the UK, in France. Polarization is very striking at the geographical level. And then it undermines the social contract. So my question on that is, should we, what is the right policy answer? Is it the traditional tax and redistribute system? Is it the traditional flexibility policy, mobility policy? Or should we aim for something different, which the literature is coming up with the term place-based policy, meaning that we should have a different view of public policy which should be targeted to specific geographic area. Thank you.
Who wants to take any of the questions that were asked first? Also, David, please.
Just a really quick observation, one thing that I don't think has been mentioned yet. My name is David Gould. I'm with the ECA Chief Economist Office. The idea of fairness, I think a lot of the concern about the rise of populism and what's generated it is the lack of fairness. And when I talk about fairness, it's not about inequality, because you can have high inequality, but if you feel as though that the rich have gotten richer because of what they've done through hard work, people are willing to accept that. And I think today there's a greater sense that people are richer, or even amongst the poor, that some are getting advantages that they don't get. And that's an idea of governance. It's an idea of the rule of law. I think Roby would appreciate that, being from the governance GP. How do we get at that? How do we get at this sense of creating a fairness? And I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I do know that is something that's come up in a lot of surveys amongst people that are discontent with their station right now. It's not necessarily that they're at the bottom of the income distribution. It's that they don't feel as though that they've been treated correctly.
A couple of different thoughts on that. I mean, some of it is also information, because again, this is sort of U.S., but so a lot of the states that have voted for Trump, that have voted for Republican representatives that are trying to sort of take away a number of public services are in fact the states that are net receivers. And so it's as if in some sense, the voters don't necessarily understand. While they may think they're being unfairly done by, they in fact are getting a net incoming transfer of resources. So some of it is also just some information that may not always be there. I think this question of uncertainty is actually another piece of it. So it's both an unfairness and an uncertainty, and a concern that changes are coming and you're not going to weather them well, and how to deal with that. So yes, there's a safety net question. There's a skills question of how well you can be able to master, be able to weather that. And there's also, I play the private sector side, right? The question of what opportunities, who's going to be providing income opportunities, where are the jobs going to be? And so paying attention to what does it take for there to be inclusive opportunities for enterprises is part of that whole equation. And I don't know that fairness is the right sense, but from the enterprise's perspective, this question of, is there sort of a race in some sense down on corporate tax rates? There has been something of one. It's not all the way down. But there is a sense too that what do you get for the taxes paid? So on the one hand, everyone would love to pay less money, but nobody really wants no infrastructure. People actually do care about rule of law, and they care about stability, and they care about a range of different things. So there are the sort of broader public services beyond just sort of social protection that one cares about in wherever it is that you're either living or trying to do your business. So I think, businesses understand that too. They're always willing to have to pay less, but they care that there is in fact the provision of a broader enabling environment. And if it's sort of commensurate with the kinds of things that they pay, they're much more willing to be able to pay. So I don't think there's a complete race to the bottom, because they know and care about the sort of the broader quality of what that would be. And there's also, a lot of individual locations. There's a collective action problem here too. A lot of individual locations are more than happy to offer unbelievable tax breaks, well beyond whatever benefit they're necessarily going to get. And so there's some perhaps education, but there's also, a political economy reality of a short-term, big ribbon-cutting benefit to a politician that isn't necessarily super well understood.
So on the fairness, I agree with what Mary said, but all I would say is, I think the way we usually talk about that is talking about opportunities, and that's exactly the point. I think a lot of the unhappiness that we see is not about equalizing outcomes or people thinking that outcomes should be equalized, but people feeling that opportunities are not equal. And that is, precisely, so I completely agree with you. So it's really about leveling the playing field, not sort of bringing everybody down to a particular common standards. On your revenue question, if I had the solution for that, but a few thoughts. I fully agree that it's not about using one tool or the other. I did say, I think very few countries have the luxury to do that. You should use both indirect and direct taxation to the extent that you can, because the needs, call for it. And to the extent that we can make indirect taxation more progressive, we are supportive of that. And in fact, a lot of the work that we do working with countries moves in that direction, analyzing, what the distributional impacts of indirect taxation are, and, how can you make it more progressive without it being more distortionary. We focused a lot of the conversation today on kind of taxation policy and design, but I think there's a lot still to be done on tax administration. So even just getting more money out of what you have on your books, which again was not the focus of this discussion, but I think it's a big agenda, and an agenda that has been made, I think, a little bit easier because of new technologies and new sources of data and what governments can now do that they couldn't do before. So I think that's also something that I know, I'm not an expert on this, but I know other teams are sort of exploring. And then finally, I was going to make the point that Mary made as well from the household and individual perspective, that is, I don't think everybody out there is sort of a mean, perverse person that, just doesn't want to pay taxes. But I think people do think what they're getting for their taxes. So I think there is a broader agenda here in terms of the capability of the state to deliver services. And, going back a little bit to the issue of the social contract, the problem is it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Because what you would need is, in a way, for the state to sort of rise to the challenge and signal that to citizens, and then hopefully, that translates into a slightly higher willingness to contribute, to the delivery of those basic services. But how governments do that in the absence of revenue. So I don't have a good solution for that, but I do think there's a little bit of that sort of behavioral interaction on the service delivery side.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you for the Norway example because it illustrates the point I wanted to make very well, that Scandinavian countries do not have social security systems that are based on heavily taxing employers and employees. So in transition between jobs, you receive support, and I was arguing at the beginning, not knowing this number, that it does not stifle innovation. So thank you.
I will ask you to please provide some final thoughts.
Well, actually, I want to thank everybody I thought today, actually, thank us to our panelists and also the questions and I could see in the attendance that we're all in a way struggling with these issues. There is no solutions, obviously, easy solutions to that. But I was thinking of a few things, and you asked a specific question, but I think in ECA there's a couple of things why are we so anxious about this right now? So if I were to take Mary's point, right, around firms and growth, if I look in quite a few of the ECA countries where we are particularly active, probably the biggest threat, in a way, to growth is oligarchic behaviors and firms, right? So by having firms that are basically capturing both state resources and markets. So it's actually interesting that for a while they may have been growth optimizing, to be honest. Mm-hmm. But now in their behavior, they're into dominating. So that links, I think, and if I look at the other side of the redistribution in the same countries, there's no trust that those redistribution will be effective for households and for people. And that goes back along on the history. I mean, I always love, I'm a child of ECA, meaning when the region was created, I was one of the first staff. Michal and I were among the first staff in the region. And as a child of ECA, really it was an extraordinary moment for me, having come from Western Europe, to work so much with colleagues from Eastern Europe. It's not that your experiences in life of what the state could provide, not provide, universal services, quality or not, how they link to opportunity, was totally different. So we have really very different biases on that. But what I want to say is one other thing is like one of the big anchor points, I think, in this conversation is very clear. Caroline was mentioning this issue around people have a distrust that opportunities today are as meaningful as they were in the past. And that this engine of dynamism, of mobility, are in place, be it at institutional level or being, let's say, education, having been in the past and trusted with that. And that is really, and on top of it, you have these spatial differences. I come from a tiny little town. I was growing up. Hans, you grew up in the Netherlands. I don't think that when you grew up in my time, in my tiny country or in your country, had any matter to the likely outlook on life in terms of geography. For instance, you were alluding to France. The differences are just immense. And we've done surveys in many countries. We've done also surveys, for instance, of populations affected by inflow of refugees and how into that. So I think one of the big questions we have here, for me is really interesting, is we have the pillars of that, if you want, social contract. Did it exist or not? I don't know. But all of the individual pillars are very fragile and are probably not performing in a way that is adapted to today's world. So we are struggling between the past and the future. and we're using, in a way, a set of instruments. But in all of what I heard today, one thing that, I mean, a few things that came to my mind. One, which is really very clear, is this issue of having our ability to really project ourselves in a dynamic manner, right? So France today is in the midst of a real social contract crisis. Yet you go to visit Paris today, a high-tax environment. It is the most vibrant, probably is one of the 2 or 3 most vibrant innovation pole in the world, right? So these issues for us, it would be very easy to advise. Let's say in this case, we don't advise the French government, but it would be very easy for us to advise into things, okay, flexibility here and there, while forgetting about the other side. I love the example of Norway as well, right? Which has, in terms of what has been working well into that. But into all of these, what I think from an ECA perspective is very difficult if you take that word dynamic and looking forward, is we're struggling, I think, with institutions. And institutions, I will go even further, I will call markets as institutions. We're really struggling on those core. And I use 100 times, so some of you will have heard it many, many times. I love talking to private sector. I love to talk when I go and travel to young tech entrepreneurs. And one of their first requests to us is always, they're very happy to talk to us. We ask, oh, what can we do to help you? And then first thing, stay out, right? And the next thing, say, no, but something else, you want to do something. And the next thing they tell us, make sure the government doesn't understand what we do. So that we don't get new friends that we didn't need, or in a way excessive. So I'm in a way siding with you, Mary, on that, and in a way with Hans on that. Now, on the other hand, with the same discussion, right, the most dynamic part of society, and you ask them, what is really in the long term your main constraint? What they will go is rule of law and institutions. So why can they not having people come back to their countries or stay, invest, and grow further? Rule of law and quality of institution. And the second thing is the human capital constraint. So in a way, I mean, I'm not helping you with any of the answers, but I think we've been very truthful in the discussion here that actually those sets the interrelationship with those. You cannot go into say, I'll give preference to one part, and if I do that, I'm confident that the outcomes will be on that side of positive. I think all of you at the table are very really good, have been very truthful in a way in bringing that complexity of the challenges that we are facing. And in a way, I think the way Hans has pushed it also as chief economist is that we need to, in ECA, to continuously challenge the status quo and not be lazy in our thinking and approaches on that. Because if we don't do that, then I think we really, really will get ourselves and far beyond, behind the curve into that. But I had a lot of fun on top of it. So I hope that it was shared by other colleagues. I want really to thank all 4 panelists and you, Jose Manuel, for that. And I really think that we need to continue on this work, even accepting that let's say there are no perfect choices or perfect solutions, and there are plenty of tensions, but that those tensions are actually part of taking the process forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to those of you who attended and stayed until the end. And for those of you who are watching online, if you don't have the report, it's available to download for free. You find the link in the invitation to the event. Thank you and have a good afternoon.